Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Strange to actually have more than a little bit of rain, isn't it? After that dry summer and early fall and late spring. Yeah. Yeah. It's been a busy week for me. And I gave a seminar at noon, and then I had lunch. And I've been feeling this lull after that. I'm trying to snap out of. But hopefully you're in better shape. So today I asked you to bring some questions, and you're welcome to interrupt me as I go, because I explored this topic a little bit, even went kind of overboard and did some data analysis with our last admission cycle in genetics. We'll definitely have time beyond that today. Like I said last time, I'm still trying to put together, the finer details of how I want to construct this course. So today there'll be plenty of time for questions, I think. All right, so what does it take to get in? So we're coming here, kind of at the end of our whole pre-application unit. We've covered a lot of ground, from what does a grad student do to, is it the right time for a PhD program? How do you figure out what you want to study? What might you do after grad school with a PhD? And then last time, we focused in a little bit more on which programs you might apply to and the importance of contacting potential advisors before applying. Suggestions that I made included asking people here who are close to your area of research interest for advice in terms of schools or labs that you might consider, and adding your own background reading to that, looking up interesting recent papers or labs of interest. And once you think you have a good batch of candidates, then reach out, contact a bunch of faculty, really, because you're not going to hear back from all of them, for one thing. And you won't hear back favorably from all of them either, like until they're, in terms of whether they're taking students, for example. And what you'd still like, after all of that kind of filtering, to end up with 5 or 10 schools that seem worth applying to, which, I was suggesting focusing on places that have multiple faculty of interest, at least 2, ideally 3 or more, because, things can always happen. If there's only one person that you'd ever want to work with at a given school, well, various things could happen. You could decide that your styles are not actually compatible. They could up and decide that they're leaving and moving somewhere else that you don't want to go, or outside of academia. So it's good to have options. It's good to have at least 2, and maybe ideally 3 or more faculty that you might consider working with at a given university if you're going to invest in starting a PhD program there. That's what I would suggest. So this is kind of where we got last time in terms of, this whole kind of process of researching and reaching out and coming up with a set of programs that are worth you applying to. So one thing that might be kind of hard for you to get a handle on from where you are now is this question: how hard is it to get into PhD programs? That might be, something that is not the easiest to calibrate. And the most important answer that I can give to that question is that it depends. And it depends especially on where you're applying, not just the university, but their strength in your field of interest. And so, like just to give one point example here, so the program that I will keep referring to again and again, because I have lots of data from it, UW Genetics, our overall acceptance rate for the last, 5 or 10 years is about 19%. So, we might accept maybe like 1 out of 5 people who apply. It's not that we don't think the rest are, in any way worthy. It's just, we only have so much in the way of resources to support students, mentoring capacity, and so on. And for us, specifically as a result of our NIH funding source, we end up accepting a higher proportion of students from domestic status than international, just for that bureaucratic reason. We live in a very nationalistic world, for better or mostly worse. And so although we get a lot of great international candidates, and we do interview and accept some of them, we wish we could consider more. And that's not the case everywhere, as I mentioned earlier in the course. Some programs don't have this, NIH funding consideration and would be equally happy to admit domestic and international students in general. So that's not like an across-the-board barrier. So what I really want to emphasize here, though, in terms of, it depends on the program and on the university, is that there's a whole range of selectivity, at the program level. And so compared to UW Genetics, you'd find a handful of schools out there that are more stringent, yet have even lower acceptance rate. And then you'd find a lot that have probably higher acceptance rates than that, or at least can't be as picky with the applicants they get. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily, bad places to study at all. And, I know a lot of people who are at schools that, don't attract grad students quite as readily as we do, with the combination of UW's, large and prominent biology community, and Madison is a place that a lot of people like to live. So I know a lot of people at places that are still good research universities, but that aren't really necessarily on everyone's radar. Places like Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, that are very good scientists and would be excellent mentors and are to the students that they have. And so that's kind of another point along the spectrum, I guess. And I've seen students from places like that, go on and be quite successful, PhD students, that is. And then, I would also point out that, there are less well-known places yet than, the schools that I just mentioned, including my undergraduate alma mater, Western Michigan University. Then and still now, they have a biology PhD program. There are not a huge number of students in it, and there's just, one biology PhD program on the campus. But it exists, and you can get a PhD there. There are doubtless good things about, that type of option as well. So, I wanted to emphasize that there is this whole spectrum, and you don't have to fixate, on just the very most prestigious universities in general, or even in your specific area of research. There's a lot of things to consider. So, I thought from here I would give you kind of a quantitative look in a few specific regards, not necessarily, all being the most important aspects of these applicants, but the easiest to quantify. That's what I kind of have to focus on here. I can't I can't tell you I can't tell you in any meaningful way, well, how good were all their letters of recommendation? And that's not even something that you totally know, given that they're kind of anonymous. I can't, I don't have an easy way to summarize for you how good their statements of purpose were, or various other, more kind of qualitative aspects of their applications. Some things, though, I can summarize pretty well. And one statistic that I have totally invented here, but actually, probably does track something that many graduate programs consider fairly relevant, is a way of quantifying the amount of research experience. And so, for UW Genetics, we have a supplemental application that asks students, for each lab you've been in, how many months did you work there? And what was the average number of hours per week that you spent on research in that lab? And from that, you can actually calculate this statistic, which I have called full-time research month equivalents, or FTRMEs, because everything has to have an acronym. So this is just a way of summarizing amount of time spent on research, basically. So the idea here is that we're going to assume that full-time means 40 hours a week. And of course, when you're a student, you don't spend 40 hours a week in the lab, not during the semesters anyway. So maybe you spend 10 hours a week, I don't know. And, across a whole academic year, if you're just, working there during the semesters, and that's 8 months, then, well, that 10 hours a week, is 1/4 time, basically. So if you do that for 8 months, you have 2 FTRMEs. I need a catchier name for that, don't I? But anyway, I'm going to show you a little bit of data on that, and I'm going to show you data that is specific to domestic applicants to our program, just to keep things a little bit more consistent in terms of applicant backgrounds. So how much research experience do they have at the time that they apply? And then outcome, I'm going to focus on just the outcome of, were they invited for an interview, or were they instead just declined at that step? So obviously the outcome you want from your application is to be invited for interviews. And then after the interviews, you get a final decision on your acceptance. So invited and declined are the 2 outcomes here. So overall, there is a pretty big difference here. This might seem a bit imposing, but I'll show you a little more in-depth data, and there's quite a range on these numbers. It's not like everyone we invited had 20 FTRMEs. That would probably feel kind of scary to you, because, probably very few, if any of you, have 20 FTRMEs at this stage. Whereas the mean for those that were declined was 10. That may seem scary too, because a lot of you don't have 10. But as I'll show you, there was a bit of a range to that. So this is plotting that more like a histogram. And so it seemed like maybe if there was such a thing as kind of a drop dead cutoff, then at least in this particular year, no domestic applicants with less than 5 full-time research month equivalents. Did I get my acronym wrong here? Yes, I got my own acronym wrong. Okay, FTRMEs. Nobody with less than 5 happened to get in this particular year, but a fair number, between 5 and 10 did. And, there's not even really a great deal of differentiation until you get like, above 30. And then it happens that, those above 30, at least in this batch, tended to get in, but I wouldn't think that that would always be the case. I'll come back to this in a moment too, in combination with GPA. So GPA is a little more self-explanatory. So we could take a look at the domestic applicants, at least those that went to schools with typical 4.0 scales. Does grade point average matter? The answer, well, somewhat. There is a difference, at least, in the mean between the invited and declined groups. Some of you might be thinking, oh, this doesn't look good for me either, because my GPA is below that. And so, again, it's important to consider the range. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that these applicants didn't all go to UW-Madison or a similar undergraduate location. Some of them went to places where if you went there, probably your GPA would be a good bit higher too. Keep that in mind, and we try to keep it in mind too. But anyway, I mentioned that the range is also important to consider here. So this is a histogram of the GPAs for our invited group in orange and our declined group in blue. So, I mean, there's a couple things to notice. Like, yeah, there you can kind of see the effect. You could see maybe, maybe our committee members, either they were impressed by GPAs up in this range, on average, or else those GPAs correlated with other things that they were impressed with. Maybe there's an effect there. On the other hand, notice this is specifically the people who reported 4.0 GPAs. I'm pretty sure none of them went to UW-Madison. But anyway, notice that they didn't all get in. That's not necessarily enough. In fact, we get some applicants from students with perfect or near perfect grades and 0 or near 0 research. They're kind of making a guess at what it takes to get into grad school. Unfortunately, their guess is wrong. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But, it may even be a bit fluky that we don't have anyone in this group who was invited with a GPA less than 3.2, because that's definitely happened, I think, multiple times since I've been on admissions. And I could even think of, one individual who ended up joining our program, who had an undergraduate GPA of 2.11. And did we take him right out of undergrad? No, I don't know if he applied, but, he went on, did some other things. Those things went well. Those things, helped him eventually get an interview and get accepted into our program. That might have been, several years after his undergrad, but, there was still a way, even in that case. So the other thing we can do is to kind of look at these two factors together. This is kind of a scatter plot of FTRMEs, so full-time research month equivalents, and GPA. And here, I mean, you can make some sense out of this. I don't know how clearly you can see this back there, but you could probably see there's especially an advantage of being toward the right side of this plot. There's some advantage of being toward the top as well. There's a handful of people. So, one curious thing, and maybe it makes sense. The ones with, maybe like 5 or 10 FTRMEs who got invited, most of them had pretty high GPAs, although a couple did not. And so that's interesting. You know, there are a few down here who were persuasive to us, even though they did not have a lot of, you know, long research experience, and they did not have the highest grades. Other aspects of their application were clearly persuasive to us. You know, but on the other hand, you know, one thing to notice too is, you know, points like these. So, you know, like amongst those who had lower GPAs, you know, sometimes it might be a matter of time. It might be a matter of spending some years in full-time research, you know, before, you know, they can get into the program that they want. And so, you know, as with the example I just mentioned, you know, the guy with the 2.1 GPA, you know, sometimes that means that the road to enter a PhD program might be a little longer, but it could certainly still happen. So, but on the other hand, you know, like you could see that there are some inviteds down here. You could see that there are some declines up here. And so clearly there must be other things than these that matter as well. And so, you know, I do want to emphasize that although these are two things that I found myself able to quantify for all of our domestic applicants from last year, that does not mean that these are even together anywhere close to, you know, being sufficiently predictive of who could get in, who could get an interview in our program. You know, and there are all sorts of other things about their applications that matter as well. You know, like you know, I mentioned fit here. Well, you know, probably a few of the blue X's up here are people who took advantage of the fact that, you know, you could apply to 3 UW graduate programs for the same price, but they were pretty clearly better suited for a different UW graduate program. And we didn't really want to waste our time having them tell us that later on. So, you know, that may account for some of the points on this plot, but, you know, still, there's a lot of other things that we consider that matter as well. And that's why, you know, there's not just a clean break anywhere on this graph that you could draw. You can't draw a line anywhere here that separates all of the orange plus signs from all of the blue X's. So these two factors alone are not adequate to predict the outcomes of our application review process. Another thing that people sometimes wonder, and I threw this in because, well, sometimes I hear misconceptions about it, and also I threw it in because you know, it was straightforward enough for me to flip through ridiculous number like 90 or so CVs. Yeah, I really did that to see like who had publications. So the answer, no, you do not need publications before you apply for PhD programs. So in our group, you know, actually about half had some kind of publication, either, and I'm just talking about the invited applicants. So actually, no, I did not flip through all 90 of their CVs. I couldn't. I looked at just the invited ones in this case. And that was, I don't know, 30 or so. So out of those, about half had some kind of publication that they were an author on that was either accepted or submitted to a journal. But, you know, even within that, most of those were, they were not like first author publications. And these, you know, what I would call, you know, co-author publications, at least to me, they don't make a great deal of difference. They don't make much difference at all, to be honest, in terms of how I'm evaluating PhD applicants, because, you know, just thinking about how that sort of thing has gone for undergrads in my own lab, like, you know, is that really predictive? No, it has more to do with like whether they joined a project that was kind of early or late, you know, in terms of, you know, how soon it was coming to fruition. And, I think it also reflects things about the lab, just how much they have it together, how quickly they get things published. And, these are by definition projects that someone else is taking the lead on, getting them published. So, I think maybe, some people are a little bit more taken with that, but I don't really care that much whether applicants have this type of publication or not, to be honest. The one thing that I would say is impressive to me when it happens is when applicants have a first author publication or one that they are, a co or joint first author on. But this is rare, like even amongst the applicants that we were inviting for interviews last year, only 6% of them had a first author or co-first author publication that was already published, and another 6% had one that was submitted. So it was clearly not any sort of barrier, for the rest, if they didn't have one. So again, the vast majority of our interviewed applicants do not have a first author or co-first author publication. And the rest, at least to me, don't make a whole lot of difference. So those were the things that I thought would be easy for me to quantify. Yes, question. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As in, like, would it be held against you if you didn't have one?
Yeah.
I think if you were still in your master's, I think there would be understanding of not having maybe yet submitted that work. I think like if you were 2 years out of a research master's and nothing had ever come from that, then, people might start to ponder. So I guess that's the sort of distinction that I would make. I think, yeah, for the most part, like, but then it also matters, like, well, what do your research advisors have to say about how things went? If they were still thrilled with how you performed in that lab, then it's a lot less likely to be held against you. If their letters seem kind of lukewarm anyway, then that might align more with a narrative that, things might not be coming together as they ideally should. I guess it kind of depends. Yeah. And I think actually we are, so we're almost to the end of the material that I have prepared for today, even though we've got like 45 minutes of class left if we want it. So, one thing I wanted to emphasize based on, these little swaths of data that I've been showing you is that, if you want to do it, each of you can get into a PhD program. You can, whether it is now or later, this will be possible for each of you. For some of you, it might be possible now. For others of you, it might be at least a lot more possible after a couple years. But you can get in, and I hope that's clear. And regardless of like, your grades and even the research experience that you have acquired so far, that does not close the door to ultimately getting into a PhD program. And where you get into, depending on a lot of different things, might be at one of the very best universities in your field of interest, or, it might be, somewhere that's not always at the top of everyone's list, and yet might turn out to be a really good place for you, and a place where you get a lot of, attention from your mentor, and a good result in the end. And of course, as we've mentioned before, there might be a difference between where you could get into now and where you could get into later. And so that doesn't mean that you should wait or you shouldn't. it's just a trade-off to consider, and part of, the overall individual decision making that you're faced with, and that there's not a single option, that is right for everyone. So I'm going to be saying a lot more about things that we consider in the admissions process in a future class. So this is not the end of that. After we go through the different elements of the application, which is kind of like the next unit of this course, I'm going to come back to like what do we do with that information on our admissions committee? And I'll show you, like the guidance that I give to our application reviewers. Wow, it's like knowing the answers to the exam, right? So you're going to hear a lot more about this kind of thing. But nevertheless, I want to give you a chance to, to ask some questions and, just, hear what's on your mind, like, anything we've covered, thus far, anything that pertains to this whole kind of pre-application stage, or what does it take to get into graduate school. Again, we're going to say a whole lot more soon about like the application itself. I'm sure you're eager to get into that part of the course and the parts that come after in terms of interviews and picking a program. But I would really like to hear if you have any questions about, anything connected to the topics we've covered so far, or just, if there are topics that we haven't covered and that you don't obviously see us scheduled to cover in the coming weeks. All of this can help in terms of, helping to build this into the best possible course. Yes, up here. Mhm. Oh, yes. Yeah, you guessed right about that. And yeah, I guess, yeah. I could cover this like, when we go to the class that's titled the admissions process, I could tell you more about what we do, and I could go into a little more detail about that. But basically, you're right. Yes, we have rounds of review. So we have an admissions committee that in our case includes not only 6 faculty, including me, but 4 current PhD students. And then, okay, well, we have, actually in total, probably like, I don't know, 160 applicants or something like that. And so if you include the domestic and international applicants. So, where we start, like, we send each application out to a couple of reviewers, and they based on all the advice that I've given them, they basically have to assign a score to each application that is assigned to them. And if this, if either one of them thought that person was pretty good, then they'll advance to the next round. Or, like if it's borderline at that stage, then I'll give that application an extra look and see if I want to carry them along to the next round. So in the next round, it goes out to like 3 more reviewers, and they score it. And then, we take a look kind of as a group at all of these applications that got scored by 5 people because they survived the initial cut. Some of them are pretty easy to cut, like, because there are applications where the person's never done any research, or their interests just seem wildly inappropriate for our program. But then we have to talk about the the list of them. We don't have time to talk about everyone in a single meeting, or even in a couple of meetings, not even if the meeting's a few hours long. So I sort like the applications by score. And then I draw a couple lines on that and I say, okay, well, above this line, it seems like everyone liked them. Can we just vote to, batch invite that group? And then I'll say, okay, well, below this line, they didn't do quite as well. Does anyone want to kind of, rescue someone below this line and put them into the group that we'll discuss? And then we'll otherwise discuss everyone between those lines and make, democratic decisions about who within that group we want to invite for interviews. So that's basically the answer. Yeah, does that address your question? Okay, I think I saw a hand over here next.
For GPA, was that based off their entire cumulative undergrad GPA, or was it like the most recent undergrad?
That was total undergrad GPA. Yeah, and I only included undergrad even if there was a master's. Just to keep it consistent because they all had an undergrad GPA. I threw out the couple that included like A pluses in their schools GPAs and just used the 4.0 scale ones. Up here, yep. Oh, sorry, I'll come back. But I would say we do sometimes end up looking at transcripts and we do sometimes notice trends. So we might notice like, if someone had a really challenging, freshman year and their grades more recently have been much better, that is something we might potentially notice. Sometimes people find a way to draw attention to that in their essay as well and try to explain like, what they struggle with early on and what they learned from that, and how they grew from that. Anyway, I wanted to touch on that because you kind of, you brought up like, is it just, the end or something like that. So, that can be something that either gets noticed or gets pointed out, I would say. Sorry, yes. You mean the identities of those advisors? Like, or are you asking, does it help that you mention people, or are you asking, does it matter who you mention? Ah, okay. In our case, not usually. So the only time, we might ever wonder about that would be like if an applicant who we liked only mentioned like one faculty member that they're interested in working with, or maybe they mentioned two, but we know that one of them's not an option, like, okay, they're now retiring or something, or they're leaving the university, or, we know for whatever reason that they're not going to be taking students. So, maybe we reach out to the other if that applicant is in a borderline group. It's not something that we really have the bandwidth to do a whole lot of. But, this is from the perspective of a rotation program and from the perspective of inviting people to interview for these program admission rotation slots. If someone, if we, if we're not able to offer them that, there still might be an opportunity for them to secure direct admission to the program with a particular lab. And so, I've been trying to be more proactive about this than the program used to do. So I don't know if all programs do this, probably not. But what I do is, for at least for the groups that the admissions committee thought was, past a bar of admissibility, but we didn't have enough, spots for them really to interview for program rotation slots. I let them know of their situation and that they might want to consider, if they haven't already, contacting individual faculty to ask about the possibility of direct admission. And, I do the same thing after our interviews if we're not able to accept, all of the interviewed students who we still felt were potentially admissible to our program, because of funding limitations. So, clearly in those cases, it becomes all dependent on who you want to work with. And what their funding situation is and so on, and their specific impressions of you as an applicant. But in terms of the work that we're doing for program decisions for rotation slots, that we're not extensively considering which faculty they're interested in, and we're not frequently reaching out to individual faculty based on who is mentioned. As I'll mention again later, it's better if they have mentioned at least a few faculty that they would be interested in working with. And yet, even though we say so on our website in terms of our advice for the application statement, we nevertheless get a substantial number of applications that do not mention any specific faculty that the student might be interested in working with. And sometimes we're really sometimes we really have to kind of make an effort to figure out what they're interested in, which is not a great thing. Sometimes there are applications that otherwise seem great, and they haven't mentioned anyone in our program that they might want to work with. And a handful of those might still get interviewed, but it's definitely a negative if they don't mention anyone. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a senior thesis, I mean, I would say that's a small factor. I wouldn't completely dismiss it. It's something that people might notice on a CV. It's a good thing to have done, just like, presenting your work at any type of conference is a good thing to have done. But, like in neither of those cases is it going to get you into grad school. So I wouldn't imagine it being a decisive factor. I wouldn't imagine it being a major factor in any admissions decision, but it could only be a positive. I think on average, it might be a small positive in the balance of things. But, just to follow up on that, if you're going to do a thesis that is a research thesis, maybe you can publish it. Like UW has its Journal of Undergraduate Science and Technology. Why not give something like that a try? And, then you have something that might be seen more like a first author publication, and even if a first author publication is not in, like a well-known journal, it still entails an important experience of the scientific process, including, having gone through some type of peer review. So if you're going to put in the work to do the thesis, well, maybe it can be a publication. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what type of research position like might you be able to get coming out of your undergrad? It's a hard question to answer. It might be one that is very dependent on your research area. But, I mean, maybe it should be a little bit easier for me in terms of your current research area, right? Because you work in the Ragsdale lab, is that right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the closest labs to my area of interest. So it partly, and it might also depend on how wide a net you're casting, like, do you want to definitely stay in Madison this next year, or are you open to going somewhere else? Because like, if you want to do work in a specific area, like if you want to do research in population genetics, I can't guarantee that there is any relevant position at UW-Madison at the time that you want it in that area. But somewhere there will be. It's just hard to predict where. Look on Evoldir, by the way, Evoldir. That's the website that has the positions you're looking for, especially if you're willing to look beyond Madison. So that is individual advice, for you. That probably only applies to maybe at most one other person in the class. So it's a little unpredictable, like what might be available either here or somewhere else. And an important thing to assess as you look at some positions is, will you have the opportunity to lead or play an important role in a research project? And it might actually be harder to do that in just 1 year. 2 years might be a lot easier, and it might be an easier sell with a potential advisor as well. Like from a advisor's perspective, like, there's a big difference between having someone come in and stay for a year and then having to replace them and teach someone else from the ground up versus having someone who stays even a second year. So you might find, even if it's not stated in an ad, you might find in practice that there's a strong preference for someone who might stay more than 1 year, even if it doesn't have to be that much more than 1 year. So, you have to make sure that there are aligned expectations in that regard. It's not to say it can't work, but it depends partly on your background. Like for a lot of students, they might find, like some sort of molecular lab research position, or at least something that involves some research and maybe just some general lab upkeep as well. If your experience has been more like in computational research, which is what the Ragsdale lab does, then that could work. I mean, labs are always looking for people with computational skill sets. There was not that long ago, I listed like a job for like a research staff person, and it wouldn't have demanded necessarily more than like an undergraduate degree, but I was looking for some kind of initial like computational biology background, and I got all of 7 applicants for that position. I think, yeah, I can't remember if maybe they goofed something up in that listing. It tends to happen sometimes, but yeah, 7 applicants, and only one of them had ever done any research remotely similar to my field. Most of them had never done any computational biology, so they were pretty aspirational applications. So, I mean, that could work. And especially like if you're fairly targeted in terms of like where you want to be or the type of research you want to do, I might even kind of treat that a little bit more like, my advice for looking for grad school. Like, don't just wait to see what's advertised. Contact people. They might not advertise something because they don't think they would find what they were looking for, just like with the experience that I just described. And so if they know that you're interested in their lab, and that you'd be available at a particular time, like, when you graduate, then that could enter into their decision making. And it might help them to choose something that they might not have otherwise chosen. And so I would recommend, even for this sort of position, even if you don't think you want to go right on to grad school, maybe you want to take the prospective advisor inquiry email that we're drafting for next Friday and kind of tweak that into something that's asking about a full-time research position, starting around summer 2024. And you could mention there too that you are you're hoping to progress to a PhD program in the next few years. And so that way they have a sense of what you're looking for. They know that you'd like to go on and really continue in this field. They know that you've picked out their lab specifically, and they're not just, so you're not just like, one of the however many people that applies to some position. You're kind of setting yourself apart when you do that, rather than just being one of, in some cases, maybe like 30 or 40 different applicants for a given position. So I would recommend being proactive, and contacting the places the group leaders of the labs that you'd most like to work with as you take your next step. Did I get to your question without too much tangential stuff? Okay. Other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will cover that. I think I'm even going to have you interview each other during one of our classes. But that's only after I say more about the interview process. So I'm not going to go too in depth on that right now, but I mean, some of the key advice that I would give for interviews is just show your enthusiasm, both for the work that you've done and for the program and labs that you're applying to. I would say definitely think ahead about the ways in which you would like to talk about the research that you've done, and think about how you would like to describe your forward-looking research interests in person. But the other thing, that I would emphasize, and that, might help to maybe even put you in a bit more of a confident mindset, is that the interview is very much a two-way process. So like when we're interviewing applicants, it is still partly figuring out who we want to accept. We don't offer program acceptance to everyone we interview. On the other hand, we do offer program acceptance to a substantial majority of those we interview, because it's very time consuming actually to interview students in terms of faculty time. I think we're already squeezing about what we can out of our faculty in terms of meeting individually with prospective students. So we don't want to mess around. We don't want to be interviewing people who are unlikely to get in. And so, in that regard, the interview is also very much, and I would say even more, about recruiting than it is about evaluation. It is both those things, but it's recruiting first and evaluation second overall from our perspective. And so, you know, from your perspective, you know, the interview is an important time to, you know, to further evaluate this program and whether it might be the one that you'd want to choose, assuming it is one of your ultimate options. And so you want to make sure that you're approaching this and ready to gather the information that will help you decide. So that's kind of a preview of the interview step. Uh-huh.
Let's say you had in mind programs, specifically more competitive. Would you recommend reaching out to someone to get a better understanding of where your application should be at for that program and how to do that?
Right. You know, I wonder if the best feedback is still ultimately going to be from these individual faculty contacts, you know, that we're orienting this next assignment around. You know, I think their answer will partly depend on you know, how strong a prospective student they perceive you to be, based on the information that you're providing them about what you've done, and you know, and the content of your message. So, you know, if they seem pretty lukewarm and don't have time to meet with you, then that's probably saying something. I don't know, like, I don't know if there's really a good option, you know, to like, you know, apart from like people you want to work with, I don't know if there's necessarily a good option to like, you know, send someone your application and, you know, to hear back from them on, yeah, you're likely to get in or you're not likely to get in based on what you have right now. I don't know of a good way that would happen here. I don't actually tend to get that kind of request, you know, forwarded to me from our graduate coordinator. She might get a handful of these, and, you know, give it her best. I mean, she's in the room, you know, when we make these decisions. We happen to have a very, you know, well-qualified graduate coordinator in our program who has a doctorate in education, but most programs don't necessarily have someone like that. And she might have a decent handle on someone's odds. So, I mean, you can try to write to someone in that sort of role, but you might or might not get a really informed response depending on the individual in that position. You know, like in the past, we've had other people in that position who would frankly have no idea you know, about whether an individual would likely get into our program. You know, that's partly why I was trying to show some of the data here that I did in this presentation, at least to give you kind of like, you know, one point of reference in terms of UW specifically. And you can extrapolate as you see fit between us and any other prospective program that you might consider. You know, keep in mind, like, you know, we are top 10 university in the US in this field. But, you know, there are probably places that can be even, you know, a bit pickier yet than we can. So, yeah, that's a tough one. You know, it might just be a matter like, you know, if you feel like you want to go on to a PhD program at this stage, it might just be something that you have to give it a try and see what outcomes you get. And I know that's not a perfect answer. For one thing, you know, it can be an expensive way to hear back negatively. But you know, and unfortunately, it is not any sort of built-in outcome of the system to get any feedback if you don't get invited for an interview. You know, we don't have any across the board system. Sometimes, you know, occasionally somebody might write to our graduate coordinator and ask if they could have any feedback. And yeah, I think a handful of those have reached me, and sometimes it's been easy enough to say, you know, like, well, you know, you seem promising, but you really need another year or two of research experience or something along those lines. So, you know, that's one thing I would say is if you do apply and you're declined and you don't feel like you have the options you want in this application cycle, you can write to them after the fact and ask, you know, what they think would really help your application. And maybe some of them won't respond, but, you know, maybe some of them will say something useful. So, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of, you know, a reliably useful way to kind of, you know, have a pre-evaluation of your application. I don't know of any, you know, way to do that at a particular institution. But yeah, but I do think you can get information from contacting faculty in that regard. You know, and it may be something where you can kind of extract some information from them too, especially if they're willing to meet with you. You know, you can ask, like, you know, what are you looking for in prospective grad students? Is there anything else that you'd like to see from my application that you don't see yet? Like, especially like if you've sent them your CV alongside an email. You know, you could try to get what you can out of those contacts. And otherwise, you know, it's probably just a matter of applying and seeing what happens. And, you know, if it's not what you want, then seeing if you can get any feedback about that. That's probably the best I could suggest. Other questions? Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, sometimes applicants do that and it cannot hurt. And, you know, it might be seen favorably. You know, you know, you could say, you know, like, I am interested in, you know, and then, you know, you could list a few faculty. You could say, you know, like faculty A, who I recently enjoyed meeting with, faculty B and faculty C, you know, but you know, it's yeah, in that context, you know, it's also nice to say at least a little bit about, like, you know, like, I'm interested in faculty A's work on blank. You know, you don't want it to come across as just like, you know, I was super crunched for time and I looked at your list of faculty mentors and I randomly picked 3 names. And do not ask me what they do. So you know, it's nice to do more than just list them from that standpoint. And it's you know, it's nice if it kind of makes some sense, like if it dovetails with what you've expressed as your scientific interest. You know, like sometimes we get odd matches of, like, you know, saying I'm interested in this and then listing faculty that don't really do that. You know, or just, you know, maybe they don't clearly articulate their interests and they list a few faculty who, at least within the scope of that graduate program, seem to do wildly different things. That might, you know, come across as, well, you know, haven't really figured out what they want to do yet. But you know, your specific question was, you know, could it make sense to to mention the contact that you've had with faculty, I would say yes. I would, yeah, I would definitely endorse that. Up here, yes. Mhm. Have you heard that? Have you heard that response? Oh, okay. That's interesting. I've not heard of that before. I certainly would never. So the faculty feel that they are not allowed to meet with students? That might be just kind of a cute way of saying I don't feel like I have time. Or like, I'm willing to meet with you if you reach the interview stage. That might be what they're saying. Yeah. I doubt that any graduate program has ever said to its faculty, we don't want you meeting with prospective students before they apply. That's very unlikely. So it's probably a decision regarding their own time allocation in terms of, it may be just their own policy that they've decided on in terms of like, I'm not sure I want to budget the time in my schedule to meet with someone who might not even get invited to the interview stage. So that's interesting. Yeah, sorry. Could you repeat your question though? Oh, okay. So that's a good question. So like if you're able to set up a time to talk with faculty, how should you prepare for that? I would say in some of the same ways that I just described for an actual interview. So, be ready to, to talk about the research that you've done and, be able to, I would say, articulate the central question behind your research project and to describe what you did and why, and to if assuming you have results, to describe what you found, to be able to interpret that and to say something about the significance of the project, like why is this important. Those are all good things to be able to say about your research project. And, the other big thing is to, to be ready to talk and ask questions about their research. And so, it could be good certainly to have read through their lab website and, maybe to have read through some, I would say maybe several journal article abstracts and maybe maybe 2 or 3 papers that you've at least mostly read through and that reflect what you're most interested in about their lab, and so that you could ask questions about that. And one great topic along those lines is about future projects, like you could ask them where they could see this research going in the future, because that's naturally very relevant for a prospective graduate student. And I think I mentioned one other time that on very few occasions I've had prospective students actually suggest potentially worthwhile extensions of research that I've published, and that is enormously impressive when it happens. It's not an expectation, but if you do that, you've definitely made a good impression. So yeah, being ready to talk about their research. But also, I think this is a great opportunity to ask, other questions that are not like that are not about, you know, the research topics, but that show that you're thinking deeply about what it will mean to be a graduate student. You know, so asking the professor about, you know, what is most important to them, in terms of their expectations for their graduate students. That'll also help you to get an initial feeling of, you know, would I want to work with this professor? And so, you know, asking them about their style, like, you know, how kind of like hands-on or hands-off are they as an advisor, is a question that I get asked a lot. And, you know, as I've mentioned, there isn't necessarily one right answer to that question. But you know, it partly depends what you're looking for. You know, some people might feel pretty confident, you know, about being able to do what they need to do. And their main concern is, you know, not having an advisor who's breathing down their neck all the time. Somebody else might feel like they need a little bit more help getting going. And their main concern might be, you know, I don't want an advisor who's, you know, just, you know, always off doing something else and doesn't, you know, have enough time to meet with me on a regular basis. And so, you know, getting a sense for, you know, what that mentor style is like, what their expectations are like, you know, and anything else that's important to you, you know, like if it's important to you to be able to do something, you know, else specific during your PhD, you know, like get, you know, some solid teaching experience or other career development opportunities, you know, ask if they're supportive of you doing that. You know, that can all be relevant. So yeah, that's the other advice that I could think to give about, you know, what to maybe prepare for and talk about if you're setting up meetings with faculty. Well, this is awesome. Like, you know, I'm always very impressed by, you know, the quality of your questions in this group. We're down to just the last few minutes. So, you know, I'm going to go ahead and, you know, point to our next class. And before then, you know, this is following right in line with what we've been talking about recently. The draft of your email to a prospective advisor is due. And so, you know, this is talking about a lot of the things that we've been referring to. And so, you know, this should very much be your own. Don't feel like you have to rigidly follow, you know, what's in this paragraph, but, you know, this is at least kind of a starting point for things you might want to consider having in there. I would say too, in general, just to let you know what to expect from me, I'm not planning to provide a lot of, you know, detailed feedback on these initial short assignments. What I'm going to really dig in on and knock myself out on is providing feedback on your statement of purpose. And so, you know, with 30 or so of you, that will just about kill me to do it in time. Like, you know, I'll probably be working on it like over Thanksgiving. But that is where, you know, I am really going to dig in and provide feedback. If there are other specific things that you want feedback on in these initial assignments, let me know specifically. You know, otherwise, you know, you may find that I've just like, you know, given you the points for some of these if you've basically done what the assignment seems to be asking you to do. So also, you know, I am continuing to set up most of these assignments on Canvas as discussions. In some cases, I figure there might be benefits to seeing, you know, what other students are thinking, you know, and how they're approaching these things. But if in any of these assignments you're not comfortable with that, I have mentioned, you know, in the postings that you can contact me individually instead. All right, so the time is now exactly 3:45. So we are done on time, and I will see you next week. And we will launch into the PhD application itself. Sure.
So